Stan Hegt, welcome to the podcast.
Hey Robby, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm very humbled and honored to have you here. I've heard from a very close friend of both of us, Dennis, that you're the best hacker in the world.
Oh well. That's definitely too much of an honor.
How,
But I'm really happy to be here.
and that you've been like teaching banks how to do their security, literally when you were in your early 20s. Is there any truth to that, or?
Well, that's Dennis being Dennis probably. But well, I'm not gonna say that I'm the best. Definitely not. But I think I was about 10 years old when I got into hacking. Um, Most of the kids of my age were playing computer games, and I just literally sucked at playing them. So I was trying to find out different ways to still being able to win the game and beat my friends in it. And that turned out to be computer hacking,
Mm.
which started with memory hacking of games like Command and Conquer, which was a really cool game, but I was really terrible at it. So, but I knew that, well, this amount of money which I have in the game, it should be kept in memory of my computer somewhere, right?
Mm.
So let's start hacking into it and see whether I can get a couple of millions in this game instead of instead of being completely broke. That's where it started, turning hobby into profession.
Mm.
So I was still a teenager, and I then had the chance to work for a company. I think it was like 14 or 15 years old. They found my name on the internet. I had a handful of vulnerabilities which I published, some CVEs and that kind of stuff. And this company, they found me, and they said, "Well, can you test the security of our clients?" They were a internet design company, and I was like, "Sure, much better than working at a grocery shop
Mm.
or whatever I was doing in that age." Um, so that was awesome. Um, if I calculate back, I think I was making like 10 euros an hour or so, which for me was like more than double what I was earning in the grocery shop. Um, but for my clients, it must have been a big laugh in those days. Um, Anyways, I ended up at a company which I never expected to join, which is KPMG, a large accounting firm. People wearing suits, doing boring stuff with numbers. Had a lot of fun, and in the period which I was there, which is for about 9 years, I have witnessed the shift from traditional security testing, pen testing, towards what we call red teaming nowadays.
Mm.
And even when this term red teaming wasn't coined yet, you could already see that shift happening, meaning that our clients were more and more interested in, okay, um, but we saw you during this penetration test. And then we would have to explain, yes, but the pen test that we were doing, it's around finding as much vulnerabilities as we can. We didn't try to stay under the radar because the goal was to find vulnerabilities. So the questions would come in, but how would a real attacker do that? Well, more low and slow, and he doesn't need to find all vulnerabilities. He just maybe needs to find one or two to progress. And then the client would ask us, can't you do that next time to see whether we are able to detect an attacker? And we would say, yes, of course. And then after detection, the client would say, well, we detected you. And we would have to explain, well, detection is a really important step, but would you be able to investigate what's happening and would you be able to eradicate the attacker from your network? They were like, good question. Let's try next time. So that is basically how pen testing evolved into attack simulation or red teaming, as we call it nowadays. I've witnessed that at my time at KPMG. And when this term red teaming was finally getting more familiar in the industry, I was leading the red team from the Dutch perspective. And the Dutch firm at KPMG was lucky enough to have some broader coverage in Europe, Africa, and some other countries in the world. So flying around the world quite a bit, doing some really cool hacking stuff. Until in 2016, a really rare chance came by. Um, a couple of fellow hackers, which I knew from both IRC as well as the KPMG network, they said, well, shouldn't we start something together? And although I was still having fun at KPMG, this chance I couldn't just let pass. So I grabbed that with both of my hands, and that turned into Outflank in 2016.
Well, Mr. Hegt, I want to dive into everything around what you were just mentioning, red teaming. I heard that TIBER really loves you guys as well for all the great things you're doing, and as you've contributed to that. So I want to ask you some questions about that. And I hear you have this this tool set that is top notch and somewhat controversial because it's the stuff you have in there is really powerful. So we're gonna dive into that today, if you don't mind. So, but if I've understood you correctly so far, the difference between penetration testing and this red teaming is that pen testing is just, the good old, here's the report, this is where you're vulnerable, and you just take that and you put it in your, your scoof, whatever that is. You put it in your drawer and don't look at it anymore. Whereas red teaming is basically helping them to see where they're weak and moving them along the journey from just a vulnerability to actually how to train and fix that. Is that an okay definition, or did I miss a bunch of things there?
It's pretty much okay. At least you have been able to make some sense out of my ramblings.
Yeah, right.
I, first of all, I want to make clear that definitely red teaming is not better or more mature than pen testing. It's definitely not, but they serve different goals. So with pen testing, your typical goal is to be efficient and get a broad overview of as many vulnerabilities within a time-boxed engagement, meaning that your focus is on preventive measures and trying to find as many holes as you can to help the client improve their preventive posture. Of course, there's different tastes to this as well, but that's basically the idea for most of the pen tests. Meaning that this is typically something that you do when you have a new product, a new system, or you have written a lot of new code for a certain application. Then this is what you want. However, in a large environment, especially in a organization as a whole, there's more to security than just preventive measures, meaning that you want to test detection, investigation, and containment/eradication as well. And there's different tastes to this. For example, you can do this in a more open setting. And then you say, well, we call this purple teaming, where we are going to sit together as an offensive team, which we call the red team, and a defensive team, which we call the blue team, and then red plus blue is purple, and then you do this. But if you really want to simulate a real adversary, a real attacker, and see, well, how do we do as an organization if such a threat would approach us? Then that is what we mostly do, and that is what we call red teaming. So the goal is not to find as many vulnerabilities as we can. We just follow 1, 2, maybe 3 attack paths, usually over the full kill chain, meaning that we start on the internet and we go and try to get into the crown jewels. And we do that as a learning experience, to have our clients, our targets, learn how to deal with a serious threat such as this. And in order to understand why this is effective, I usually compare it to vaccinations. We turn the defensive system of our body, our immune system, to go and fight this intruder, where it learns, well, whoa, I'm not yet prepared for this intruder. I need to find a mechanism to help me defeat this intruder, and thereby we make the human body more resilient when the real virus would come into our body at some moment after that vaccination. With red teaming attack simulation, we do the same, but then not to a human body, but to an organization. So we hack into them as realistically as possible. We usually put a bit of stress on them as well, especially after we get detected. The people do not know that this is a test going on. So they do react under stress. They do investigate under stress. They do try to contain the attack and eradicate the attacker under stress as well. But then after that, they learn that fortunately, this was just a test. They learn where their weaknesses are, how they should better approach an intruder next time, meaning that if a day, a week, a month, or a year later, a real attacker comes by, which uses similar tactics and techniques as we were doing, that they are better prepared in dealing with such an adversary. That's basically the idea about red teaming. And then you learn that that is completely different from pen testing. So pen testing is identifying your holes, preventive, whereas red teaming is this learning experience for your defensive mechanism in your organization.
How do you know what's realistic and what's being, because you said there, like your goal is to mimic what the real attackers would do, right? How do you how do you know like what the real attackers are doing?
So in Europe, we have this framework, which you already mentioned, which is called TIBER. It is
Mm.
a abbreviation for Threat Intelligence-Based Ethical Red Teaming, which is quite a mouthful, but well, they had to come up with an acronym, and this turns out
Mm.
to be a river in Rome as well. So they said, well, let's use this one. So Threat Intelligence-Based Ethical Red Teaming. Basically, it means that they combine threat intelligence with red teaming,
Mm.
meaning that before we had this scheme, which is somewhat based on what we have in the UK with CBEST as well, you would see that red teams would go and simulate a threat which they would find suitable for their target, which means that there was a lot of freewheeling or YOLO testing, as I usually call it. What does the red team like to do? Meaning that we have seen some really weird red teaming attack patterns with things like flying Wi-Fi drones and a lot of focus on physical attacks, so boots on the ground. Whereas if you would look at what is actually happening at our clients in terms of incidents and what's happening in the outside world, um, I have yet to come across the first large incident with a flying Wi-Fi drone.
Yeah.
And yes, there definitely are some incidents with physical break-ins and boots on the ground. Um, but it definitely not as much what's happening in the real world compared to what we were executing in red teaming gigs. And that
Mm.
is why I'm really close that these programs like TIBER, they try to connect what's happening in the outside world with threat intelligence with red teaming. So
So keep
within
it
a TIBER
realistic,
test,
right? Mm.
yeah, within a TIBER test, basically we have a scenario analysis where based on threat threat intelligence, we come up with what we call the most dangerous courses of action as well as the most likely courses of action. So what would be most impactful and what would be most likely to happen.
Mm.
And based on that information, we come up with two scenarios, which are scenario one and scenario two that we execute in a TIBER test. And there is still some room for creativity of the red team in what we call scenario X in a TIBER test. Meaning that if you really have this business case for your client to come up with a flying Wi-Fi drone and you can explain really well why the client really needs it, then there's still some room to do that kind of stuff.
Mm.
But most importantly, there's at least two scenarios which are based upon actual threats and not just actual threats, the most likely and the most impactful threats for this organization that you're going to hack.
Mm.
And that really helps us in simulating realistic threats. Then, depending on the specific target, there's always this thin line between simulation and emulation. Are we just going to adopt the tactics and the techniques from an attacker and loosely or more or less loosely base our attack on what we observed in the past from these attackers? Or are we even going to emulate their procedures and really be a specific attack group like, for example, APT29 or Lazarus or Logbit in the criminal world? Um, so that depends whether we're going to do simulation or emulation. In most cases, it's simulation. So we have a look at what's happening in the outside world. We adopt those tactics and those techniques, and we are going to base an attack on what we observe there. And of course, especially if you look at the highest end of threat actors, the more capable nation state actors, that is really difficult for us to simulate. Because as you can imagine, us being a company of 9 people right now, we don't have the resources of a really well-funded adversary like some of the nation state actors which are in there. Meaning that yes, sometimes we do have to cut some corners, or we do have to simulate specific steps, especially if we're talking about 0 days and stuff.
Yeah, because that's the point. That's the part that you were saying that you don't have the resources for, right?
Correct. But usually those steps which are not obtainable for us, they are just a step in a complete kill chain.
Yeah.
Same works for things like third-party compromises. If you look at what happened with SolarWinds and the compromise of Microsoft and FireEye, for example, Yes, within a TIBER test, it would be really difficult to completely reproduce such an attack because of legal boundaries as well, of
Yeah,
course.
of course.
But we see that this super elite compromise of SolarWinds was just a step in the kill chain. And we can use that as a starting point within one of our scenarios as well, saying, well, what if we assume that one of your software vendors has been breached? Why don't you, dear client, dear white team, which is the informed insiders within our client, why don't you create that starting position for one of the scenarios in this test within your organization for us? So that's how we're able to simulate the highest end of threat actors as well. But that's challenging sometimes.
Yeah, of course. And then I'm reading from your website here. To maximize training effect for your security team, we also trigger detective and responsive controls. In other words, if we have hit the blind spots in our defenses, we purposely trigger alarm mechanisms in order to give your security team the field training they need. So basically, you along the way, you purposely try to test their detection and how they respond to it, correct?
Yeah. So within a TIBER test, you always have multiple scenarios, meaning that we usually have one scenario which does really its best to stay under the radar, such as nation state information theft. And we might have another scenario where the attacker isn't that much interested in staying under the radar. For example, a organized crime group trying to launch a ransomware attack or trying to extract data. So we have these two scenarios where we know, well, at least one scenario should be detected and will trigger investigation, containment, and eradication. And if not, if we do reach the impact goals before being detected, then we usually trigger detection indeed on purpose. Why is that? Because we see in the gigs that we are running that most lessons learned for our clients come after detection. They usually think that this test is about finding their preventive weaknesses and their blind spots in detection. But it turns out that in most of the tests we do, they learn about, well, how should we approach investigation at a larger scale? If we know what's happening, how should we do containment? And can we actually eradicate an attacker from our network? Because the types of scenarios that we simulate, they don't happen on a weekly basis at our organizations, fortunately. So usually it's the first time that they have to deal with this type of an incident at that scale. And when something is that new to you, to our clients, they usually learn a lot from this. So you might be familiar with the game Whack-A-Mole. So you hit them all here and another one pops up there. That is typically how a first red teaming gig at a new client ends. So yes, they might be able to detect this. They might be able to investigate at least parts of what was happening. But when they try to get into containment and eradication, they are going to, for example, isolate a single machine, reset a password of a certain account, and they would then identify that an attacker, whether they thought, well, we have whacked them here, they pop up somewhere else in the network because we are in much deeper than you would have expected. And that is a real learning experience for most of our clients on how to deal with that. So when during investigation do you feel that you have enough information to be able to actually effectively respond to this attack as well? And well, that game can be really a good learning experience, and it is usually fun for us. And we quite often hear that it has been fun for the blue team as well, especially after they have been informed later that it was just a test. So during the heat of the moment, they might say, well, this is stress and this is extreme. But usually afterwards, they say, well, this was the most excitement in my job that I've had for the last couple of years. And that makes sense because we did simulate a type of incident, a type of attack, which they definitely don't deal with on a weekly basis.
So those companies there, once they go through that experience, right? Where do they go from there? What sort of advice do you give them to like go home and do their homework on?
So these kind of red teaming gigs, they aren't like, well, here's the report with findings and recommendations. Sure, we deliver that as well. But we usually have a very lengthy purple teaming phase afterwards, where we are going to sit together with the blue team. We are going to replay all of the attack scenarios, at least the most important steps, so that they can follow them live in their systems. And we usually have a couple of deep dives with their stakeholders on specific topics. Active Directory security and Azure Active Directory security is typically something that comes back. The quality of their use cases in their SIM, so in their detective systems, as well as doing some tabletop exercises on containment and eradication. So, whereas usually the red teaming part for us is the most exciting phase of the test, I would say that the most value is being added after disclosure that this was just a test. And when we are going to combine our knowledge from the offensive perspective with the knowledge from the defensive team, and we're entering the purple teaming phase, and thereby really try to improve the posture of the security of our clients.
Cool. Tell me a little bit more about the eradication tabletop exercise. That sounds interesting.
Yeah, so what is quite an eye opener for most of our targets is that if an attacker is really deep in your network, that means that eradication can be super difficult. It's usually very difficult during investigation to find out where the attacker is and what his current information position is. Meaning that, yes, you might have detected one or two implants which are connecting back to a command and control infrastructure of an attacker. But what if we have two or maybe three command and control infrastructures running? Meaning that you might be able to cut off one line, but we have other lines in your network as well. You might have detected that we are abusing one or two admin accounts and their privileges. But what if we were able to dump more credentials of more admins, but we didn't just use them? Meaning that we might have such an advantage when we have been in for weeks or sometimes even months in your network, then it is really difficult to kick us out of the network. In some of the more advanced assessments that we did, our clients have contracted parties such as Mandiant FireEye, Deloitte, Fox IT in the Netherlands, or sometimes even you guys from mnemonic, on doing the incident response, of helping in the incident response part in the exercise. And usually these very experienced incident responders, they know, well, if we want to do some really effective containment and eradication, then we need to get a really good overview of where the attacker is. We might even need to pull the internet plug for a couple of hours and then have a really effective bang on containing systems, resetting passwords, maybe even rebuilding parts of the Active Directory domain in order to be effective. And as you can imagine, usually just before pulling the internet plug, the team is informed that this was just a test, because the business impact of pulling the internet plug from for example, a large energy company or a large bank, that would be disastrous. Meaning that is the stuff that we exercise in a tabletop exercise.
Cool.
So we're saying, well, of course, this was just a test and we couldn't actually pull the internet plug, but let's pretend that it wasn't. And let's play out what you would have done if you would have followed the advice from, for example, the mnemonic responder and said, well, we are going to pull the internet plug for a couple of hours and do certain actions. What would you have done? And then we can explain what would have been effective and what would not have been effective, given the foothold and the information position that we had in your network.
Cool. You never really know where the attacker is and what they actually have access to, I guess, huh? Unless you have logging everywhere and you have like an EDR tool. Or have you ever how confident should companies be when they do that eradication phase that they actually have everything? Or I also heard in other discussions that you have to rebuild anyway, because you never know. So if you get compromised and you're compromised, you might as well just rebuild. Or is that too much to assume?
That's too much, because rebuilding is intense. Plus, it also depends on what kind of threat that you're facing. If it is an organized crime group, which is clearly on a ransomware path, I would say try to fight back as soon as possible. If you see that it is a preparation of a nation-state destructive attack or information extraction, then I would say, well, probably you want a better information position before you are going to respond. And during response, we have this theory of what we call the OODA loop, which is observe, orient, decide, act, meaning that you are going to make cycles during your incident response, where based on your current information position, you make a certain decision and you act upon that. You have to keep in mind that that's happening within two parties in an attack. So it's not only the blue team which is making these informed decisions in their incident response, it's also the attacker making informed decisions on what it's going to do next. And then what we usually see in our gigs is that the OODA loop is not being iterated through fast enough by the blue team. Meaning that while they are still investigating their malware, which they identified, that might take hours, we have moved into your network, into other systems, compromised more accounts, meaning that you are still doing your incident response on an old information position, assuming that we might just be in that system with that malware. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So one of the key factors for effective response is being able to iterate fast enough in your decision cycle and your acting cycle in this incident response. I would say that basically 24 hours of hacking on our side can cause days or weeks of investigative work for the blue team. And they just have to decide, how deep do we want to investigate this? Or should we maybe move next, make a decision, and act somewhere else?
Which is probably, in a lot of the cases, probably the right move to do, right?
Yeah.
And I did kind of a weird question, but I started thinking about the word persistence, right? Advanced persistent threats. When they say persistent, I think you said like a nation state that's gonna try to extract some sort of information that's really important for them. They will just like embed themselves in sort of systems and just lay completely quiet so they don't get eradicated, right? Or how does that work?
So the P for persistence in advanced persistent threat also has a slightly other meaning that usually the persistence is there because you have this type of information, or they expect to be able to achieve a certain type of goal or actions and objectives, which they usually can only reach at your organization, meaning that they are going to be really persistent at trying to attack you. But given that persistence in APT, that usually also means that they can try to dig really deep into your network. And that is also something that we try to embed in our testing as well. And yes, especially if we have been able to get into a more privileged position, for example, things like domain admin, enterprise admin, or some other high privileged credentials, then we can dig in really deep. Really leave some backdoors, which might be there for a prolonged period of at least years. Meaning that even if you are able to kick us out, we might only be one phishing email away from getting back in, and then immediately being able to connect back to those privileges. And yes, that can definitely be a challenge for our clients in our testing.
I realize this could be, an hour discussion in itself, but just establishing that persistence and being able to go back to it. I've always kind of thought, like, my simple mind, I know this is not the case, but my simple mind is like, okay, if you realize you're infected, just, reformat your PC and then whatever was there before is gone. But that's not actually the case, right?
So it's not just your PC. But if you have a large network, and we have been able to access all servers, all workstations, and the core of authentication, which is things like Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, who knows what kind of backdoors we might have placed there. And you are never certain whether your investigation has a 100% coverage. Meaning that yes, in theory, the advice should be rebuild all of your stuff. But rebuilding all of your stuff is a disaster. Yeah, it's more than costly. It might be the end of your business. For example, if you're a large bank and you really have to rebuild your entire Active Directory for us and all of your workstations and servers, I don't know how you would do that without being offline for at least a couple of days or weeks. And that is simply not an option for such an organization. Right. Meaning that there's always this balance between what can we do and what is effective against an attacker.
Interesting. Cool. Moving on here. You have this notorious tool set, and you call it the Outflank security tooling. which
Yeah.
is something that you sell for 45,000 euros a year.
Yeah.
And I have, this is not from my mouth. This is from, I've heard it. It's somewhat controversial because the stuff you have in there is so powerful. And it kind of made me think of like those NSA leaked tools from back in the day, right? Because you also write in your website that some of these tools we have shared with the public, several others are too powerful for public release. So your selection of tools here: payload generator, office intrusion pack, a loader, a lateral pack, stage 1, which is a pre-C2 toolkit, and the hidden desktop. So basically all these tools, and you also write, all these tools are developed to bypass defensive measures and detection tools. How do you know what you can bypass? Do you like download those tools and test them yourselves with your own tools?
Yeah. So we have a large lab where we are testing our software with several EDRs and antivirus products in there, as well as things like Defender for Identity, which are monitoring Active Directory. So we test our tools against them, definitely. Plus, we use them in our own operations, meaning that we get feedback in our own operations. And now it gets even better. The teams which are using OST on a commercial basis, they also provide us with feedback on what works and what doesn't work, meaning that we get so much feedback, which we put back into the product, which helps us improve the product with where the other teams benefit from. So here you already see that we can really benefit from not keeping this toolkit to ourselves, but opening up to other selected red teamings, getting their feedback on what works against a specific EDR or another specific product, and putting that feedback back into the product so everyone, including us, benefits from it. So we tested in our lab and we put it out there in the wild in our gigs. That's how we get that information.
Which is exactly what the bad guys do as well, right?
Especially some of the more advanced organized crime groups, and definitely the nation state actors. They both have their own testing labs as well. And for sure, they also build their tradecraft upon what they are experiencing in the wild. Sure.
And I was just thinking, like, that's why security is never ending, because there's always somebody out there that's looking at what's out there and just re-engineering, making something new that doesn't get caught, right? That's like the...
Correct, but the good thing is that we are finally seeing some seriously good progress from some defensive products. So for me, products such as MDE, Defender for Endpoint, as well as CrowdStrike, as well as some of the service offerings that you from a mnemonic have yourselves. We are seeing some really good progress, especially with regard to detection capabilities, and that is making the life of attackers much more difficult. Fortunately, I definitely think that is a good move, and it also means several phases in our red teaming gigs more difficult. We see that initial access over the last couple of years has become much more difficult, and we see many teams struggling with that. And of course, that is also a business case for our commercial toolkit again.
Are you going to add any tools moving forward?
We're continuously adding tools. So the list that you just mentioned isn't reflecting on what's currently in the toolkit. I'm pretty sure we haven't yet had to do that, but I'm pretty sure that we will have to remove one or two tools within the coming years because they are simply not effective anymore. That will definitely happen. It hasn't happened yet, but the toolkit is continuously evolving. And right now we have set a target where we say we want to spend 70 or 80% of our time developing new tools, of our development time, and 20 to 30% in maintaining our toolkit. Because the biggest risk that we have there is that if these numbers would be the other way around, namely 80% maintenance and 20% new dev, that our toolkit would be too static compared to both the threat landscape as well as the defensive landscape. So we have to be able to keep up to date with what's happening in the outside world and being able to implement those new techniques in our toolkit as well. Plus, we have to be ahead of what EDR and antivirus are doing, meaning that we have to spend so much research and development into developing new stuff and not only maintaining the toolkit.
Right.
And that's a challenge, definitely is.
Any plans for the future that you'd like to share with us?
Yes, and so we have always been a red teaming consultancy company, and we have only made the pivot towards our toolkit the last year. And I have to say that we have underestimated this model. We seriously have. Meaning that we have recognized that there's much value, both commercially as well as for the quality of our own red teaming offerings in putting more focus into our toolkit. So for the next year, you can definitely expect more resources spent on our toolkit. So more marketing around that as well. And we definitely want to attract some more development power on the toolkit. And we already have some names working on the toolkit, which we haven't announced publicly. But I do think that within a couple of weeks there will be some announcements on Twitter with some new talent which we attracted. And those are some really good people that we're excited to not only work with us in our red teaming gigs, but also work on the toolkit.
Cool. Well, Mr. Hegt, I'm looking forward to that. It's been a great pleasure talking to you, learning about TIBER testing and an update on what the red teamers are doing out there. So thank you very much for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Robby.
Thank you so much, Stan. Talk to you soon. Ciao.
Take care. Bye.